Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in for today's webinar on adaptive leadership, getting the best out of people at work. Today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist here at Smith School of Business. And before I introduce today's guests, I want to remind you, as I always do, today's conversation will be recorded. Those of you who have signed up for the webinar will be getting that by email. However, on account of the long weekend, you will not look for it in your inboxes till Tuesday. So do not, I know you'll want it sooner. Sorry, Tuesday is the day. So feel free to share it with your community at that point. And I do hope that you'll ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I hope you will use that and ask questions often and early, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation, but do ask them along the way as they occur to you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers, Christina Benzing and Shay Dubé. Christina Benzing is the founder of Consonance Consulting and a human resources professional with more than 15 years of experience in both the private and public sectors. She's also a certified executive coach. She teaches cross-cultural management for Queen's University's Faculty of Law, as well as for Queen's Executive Education. And Shay Dubé is an adjunct assistant professor and distinguished faculty fellow of business law at Queen's University. He teaches courses in negotiations, cross-cultural management, ethics, domestic and international business law. He also teaches entrepreneurship at the Smith School of Business, where he's also the academic director for various courses, for project courses in various Smith MBA programs, as well as in the Master of International Business program. Though I do not want to miss this interesting bit of bio information that he did start his career as a commercial pilot, which is not something that many of us can say. Now, for anyone who's paying attention and thinking, how the heck are those two sharing the same screen? The answer is that they are married and they are well and truly bubbled. And it is now my pleasure to turn myself off and to introduce, to have Shay and Christina come to the fore. And I will join you guys at the end of the presentation. So Shay and Christina, welcome.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Meredith. Yeah, we're very excited to be facilitating our webinar for you today on adaptive leadership and how to get the best out of people at work. And especially now during these challenging times with the pandemic, thinking about how we maybe take a more adaptive approach as we are working with challenging virtual environments and higher levels of stress in the team, I think is really timely. And so when Shay and I were putting together this workshop on adaptive leadership, one of the things that we recognized was that while most leaders are very well aware and informed of best leadership practices, they were still struggling at some points with engagement. You know, the same leaders that would use some of the best practices, and let's take, for example, communication. We've heard the expression communicating 7 times and in 7 different ways to get your message across, yet those same leaders sometimes come back and complain about how their team or their staff didn't put the message into action, or perhaps didn't may have misinterpreted the message. So why is that? And of course, there's only one right answer, which I'm sure you're all thinking of, and I'm just kidding, because there are a whole host of reasons that affect engagement, and we're not going to touch on all of them today. But what we are going to talk about is a focus on individuality and the influence that culture plays when it comes to engagement at work, and how we can become more effective as individuals, as leaders, teams, and organizations when we take a more adaptive approach. So let's start with a quick definition of what is adaptive leadership. And as you can see, adaptive leadership is really about learning different perspectives and ways of being in order to accomplish a shared goal. So it really is our ability to learn about these different perspectives and to engage teams in open-minded dialogue. So it's not about changing who we are as leaders. So when we talk about working with diverse perspectives, we can also look at it from another frame that really what we're doing is working with different cultures. And so generally when you hear the word culture, what comes to mind? Probably national or ethnic culture is one that jumps to the forefront. but perhaps some of you are also thinking about organizational or professional culture. There's different factors that we use to identify culture. And there's actually probably just as many different definitions on culture as there are for leadership, for those of you who've studied leadership practices. So if we take a look at some of the top researchers in the area of culture, we have to mention, of course, Geert Hofstede. And he defines culture as the programming of the mind that distinguishes the member of one group from another. And so when you think about different definitions that you might be familiar with culture, oftentimes what you're not seeing is that component of national or ethnic culture. Yet at the same time, the research by Trompenaars and Hampton Turner says that national or country culture is the #1 influencer of culture in how it affects our attitudes and our behaviors and how we bring ourselves to work. And it has a greater impact than things like the industry culture or culture stemming from religion. And they have a series of about 8 dimensions that they've studied this across.
So, you're wondering, why are we talking about cultures? We live in a country for the past half a century or more has been seen as being one of the most multicultural nations in the world. But let me take a little bit of step back and provide some context. If we look at Canada in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we did have immigration. In the 70s, sometimes it was 100,000 people per year. In around 2016, what happened in Canada was that was the first time we had more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 14. We have a declining birth rate. The Canadian government recognized this. It recognized other countries are also facing this, but they did something to try to fix this. And what they did was they increased immigration. And so what we're seeing this year, I think the target is over 400,000. A few years ago, it was about 250,000, and it will continue to increase because the birth rate for the country is at about 1.5, well, 1.6, and it takes 2.1 to maintain a population. So that's one component. The other component is, if you look at this graph in the 80s, the majority of the immigration was from Western Europe. And as we start to move through the 90s, the immigration from Asia starts to increase until now. And we can see that Africa is also starting to increase. So why is this relevant? We have two factors in play right now. We have more immigrants coming to the country, and we have more diverse immigrants coming to the country. And so if we look at this graph here, what you see here is that by 2031, this is taken from Statistics Canada, 2 of the major metropolitan areas of Canada will be roughly 60% of visible minorities. And if we could play this out a little bit further, you would see many other centers would do the same thing. And I know that in Kingston at the moment, within the next 5 or 6 years, we will be short about 10,000 people to fill existing jobs. And where is that going to come from? It's going to come from immigration. Now, the other point that starts to come out is, well, people should just adjust because we've been dealing with this all along. But when there was a smaller group of immigrants, so I started working in the early 1980s, and at that time I did have to adapt because I was the minority and I had to fit in. And my name, by the way, is not Shay, it's Shailesh. And the reason I use Shay is because to fit into the mainstream, I changed who I was. It's a phenomenon called covering. So we adapt into the mainstream. And we're seeing a big shift. And so what's going to happen now is that not only will our workers, the people who make up a workforce change, but they're also our customers too. And so organizations are going to face some interesting challenges if they can't understand what's going on, and from both an organizational standpoint, internally and externally, and how do we get the best out of every individual?
Yeah, and I think that's where you see a lot of shift that's happened over the years, and where now we're finding also greater levels of challenges with engagement and maybe even with conflict at work sometimes, because there's a much greater degree of diversity than what there was in the past. And that's why we're looking at, these adaptive leadership skills because it is no longer just about the person who's coming in trying to fit themselves to the organization. Now, to really be successful and thrive, we have to think about how do we really connect with and engage the different client base that we have, customer base, and the staff that are working with us, so that we're not losing them to companies that are mastering these types of skill sets. So of course, it begs the question, what is culture? And as I mentioned before, there's so many different definitions of culture. But when we think about adaptive leadership and how we plan to use it, we looked at the definition by Edgar H. Schein, who is a very well known professor in the area of organizational behavior and spoke in depth about culture. And he defined culture is the way in which people solve problems. And so when we think about how people are solving problems at work, that's really where this comes to life. Because if you think about an organization, pretty much any organization these days puts out a very clear vision statement, has clear goals and targets that they want to meet. And I don't think people are struggling as much with the ambiguity about, what does that goal mean? Is it the right goal? So much as they are struggling with the how to get there, when there is so many different ways to look at a problem. And when people come from such different frames of reference with different value systems, different frames of reference and education and how things all put together. So that's really where the richness comes in when we start to think about how do we work smarter in working through those pieces of diversity that really then bring us to the stage of inclusivity and belongingness that we're so striving for. So Schein, of course, also was the one that had presented us with the iceberg model that, again, I'm sure those watching today are familiar with. And this is where we can see very clearly that there is that small iceberg tip on the top that is visible to us when we talk about culture. So let's take a new employee who starts work for an organization. That person very quickly, even through the interview process, but as they onboard, they start to look for all those cues of what is the culture of this work environment and how do I fit into it. They watch whether or not it's formal dress attire or what the stories are of, how people get rewarded and, move up through the chain and so forth. And they start to maybe adapt some of their behaviors to fit into that. But what I really want to point out is the 90% or so of the iceberg that sits beneath the water, because that is where we run into the challenges. And it reminds me of one organization that I started working for, where even in the interview process, they talked about, this organization prides itself on innovation and we have a reputation for high standards. And that was the messaging that was coming across on the surface. And so I very quickly felt the pressure coming into the organization of, I'm going to have to really demonstrate that I can do something, that I can get some results, and became very focused on that for the first little while, only to find out that I had missed some of the deeper culture and the cues when one of my coworkers had said to another in an open space environment where I was able to overhear, well, she obviously doesn't know how we do things around here. And so you can imagine, as soon as I heard that, I picked up on that. That's that deeper culture. And by going in too strong, I was disrupting the dynamics and the flow of the team. And so I share that story to remind folks about the power of culture and how quickly that those deeper layers of culture can really affect how people bring themselves to work, how they interact, how they engage. So that's something that we always keep in mind at the forefront.
So I want to come back to one thing. It's that 10% that we see. We judge people by the 10% that's visible. And yet a lot of the behavior, things that they're doing, how they solve problems, deal with conflict, is sitting below the waterline. We can't see that. We don't, and without understanding where they're coming from, we're losing the depth and breadth of experience and talent, because we're pushing that aside, or we're not aware of it. It's probably a better way to say it.
Yeah. And I mean, Shay and I were joking yesterday about how oftentimes in times of stressful situations, those deeper cultural values, they become more pronounced.
Yeah, you can go ahead. So what she says is, when I get stressed, what I become is my Indian culture, because I was born in India, and really that's my really underlying culture. Under stress, that's what I do. When I start reacting that way, Christina would say, "Oh yeah, your Indian side of you is coming out at this point."
Yeah, so keep in mind what stress can do. But of course, when we talk about any model or assessment tool, and of course, we're also going to be introducing another tool that we think, really lends itself well to thinking about adaptive leadership approaches, and that's the tool by Erin Meyer that she brought forth in a book called The Culture Map. And when we think about any of these assessment tools, it's incredibly important to be mindful of the risks and limitations of these types of tools. And working in human resources and organizational behavior, I know full well how enticing and exciting models and assessments are, where people can start to find different lenses and ways of looking at things. And it helps our brains to sort through all the complexities and give it some stability to say, oh, you know what, if we can say, person X is, this type of profile, then we know approaches A, B, and C might work for them. And if a person is in a different box, we look at it that way. But of course, the challenge is that if we rely too heavily on these categorizations or boxes that we can place people into and the labels that we can attach, we really risk losing the potential to get to know that individual in a very wholesome capacity. And it can be so easy to essentially offend people if we over rely on, these boxes or labels. And, that's where we come across things like generalizations, stereotypes, and the biases factor.
Yeah, so, during my early part of my career, if I was to turn my camera off right now, I have a Ontario accent, and it would be really, and my name, you couldn't tell what my ethnicity is. And when I started my first business, going into meetings, I could see people were visibly startled, because when they spoke to me on the phone, I didn't look any or sound any different. And we'd get into conversations, and then I would get a comment such as, "Oh, well, you're not like other Indians." And I know where it was coming from. I did not take it personally at that point, but others could take that, as quite a slight, both against you as an individual and against the culture you come from. And so in teaching in this area, we both found that we have to constantly balance off that we're not trying to stereotype, we're not trying to do this. And it's a very tough area to be able to teach in, and do it so that there is growth for individuals, and an understanding that everybody is valuable, and nobody can be pigeonholed into any area.
Yeah, and that's where the value of, that really curious, open-minded dialogue really helps, because we advance as, a society and as individuals by the ability to have comfortable open dialogues, and also, come with the spirit, of recognizing those positive intentions, and how do we build forward. So this is where we engage you in a bit of an audience poll. Obviously, when we think about adaptive leadership, we're really talking about how do we, create higher levels of engagement. So yeah, we're very curious to know, how do you personally feel appreciated, heard, and understood at work? So we'll just give it a few seconds for people to respond, and the results are pouring in very quickly.
Wow, that's a great response rate.
I
Fabulous.
And it just keeps pouring in.
Yeah.
So, there we go. We've got a bit of a lead there on most of the time, which is fantastic. Now, what I can say is, you who are all attending this webinar today are a very engaged group of individuals. So it's not too surprising to see most of the time come up. And of course, what the point of recognition here is that, there is a span of how we feel engaged. And so one of the the things you can take maybe a moment to do if you've got a piece of paper and a notepad is flip this around and think about how is it that you are able to help others feel valued, appreciated, heard, and understood at work. Think about what are the things that I do maybe on a day in and day out basis or a weekly basis, really to make the other people that I interact with or work with feel that sense of value, because we all know how important that is and what it means for us personally. And certainly if we're in those spaces of maybe, hardly ever feeling that, how challenging and difficult that feels. And I'm sure the vast majority of people have had some situation in some workplace or community engagement where they felt that. And when we talk about, truly reaching engagement, we're thinking about how do we help people feel heard, valued, and understood. So let's get on to the next poll. Do you want to advance that for me?
Sure. Hang on a second. There we go.
There we go. Do we close this one?
No.
Okay, perfect. So the next poll question, this will lead into as we start to talk about the model that we're going to introduce. If your boss offers an idea that you think is terrible, how do you respond? I love this one.
It's fascinating. And while you're answering this question, it's interesting as we do work with organizations, and there are people in organizations that work there that don't feel engaged themselves. They want to offer advice, but they don't know how to do it, and they're not asked the right way. But there you go, fascinating.
Yeah, so again, you can see that there's a lot of split, and it's fabulous that we see, asking questions about the idea that builds the curiosity. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that there's both some direct approaches to pulling that information and some indirect approaches. And of course, the question is what is the leader looking for? Because we don't necessarily know that. Perhaps there's somebody who says, I want you to challenge the status quo. I want you to challenge me. But then, sometimes leaders also say that and they don't line up with their actions, so that when employees come forth and say, I challenge you on this, it's sometimes rejected or met with less than stellar, a stellar type of response. And so, and another big question is how do we harness safety in a conversation, as well as recognize all these different approaches that people have, and to be able to figure out ways that we pull from everybody. So,
oops, here we go. I want to step back in time to tell you a personal story that maybe wasn't the genesis, but it was the catalyst for me starting to explore this. So a little bit about me beyond the bio that was read. By the time I was 13, I was what is classified as a third culture kid. Today, a third culture adult. I had lived on 4 continents. I spoke 7 languages fluently and understood 2 or 3 more. I'd moved to Canada, moved to South America, various places, moved to Europe because my father coming from India, my father being a professor. And so I thought I really understood culture. I thought that, I can deal with anything and I can engage people and I can figure this out. Well, I was leading a team at a company. It was about 11 members of this team spread out across Canada in various offices. And there was one time that there was a change in the industry and a massive challenge to the organization. And if we didn't adapt, there was a possibility we wouldn't exist as an organization. So I brought the team together in a central location because we didn't have Zoom back then. Getting a conference call was kind of expensive back at that point too. So we still did things face to face, and hopefully we'll be back there one of these days again. It was 6 days of meetings, 12+ hour days. We also had other members of the organization coming in because the problem couldn't be just solved by the team I was leading. It needed input from everybody else. There were some really heated discussions that went on. There was a lot of brainstorming that was going on. There was disagreement, that happened, sometimes openly, sometimes pretty antagonistically, as well as people were fearing for their jobs. But out of the team, there were 2 individuals that pretty much sat silent through this whole thing. At first, I didn't put any credence to this or pay attention to it. But then my team members started to come and talk to me and say, well, why aren't they engaging? What's going on? Don't they care? Don't they realize that this could be their job? And so now we had a team dysfunction starting to happen. And this was going on during the week as I got pulled out at lunches and at coffee breaks. Saturday night, just before everybody was going to head home, we went for dinner and I sat beside one of the team members. It was fascinating. That team member suddenly started talking to me about ideas and synthesizing everything that had happened and the challenges that were there, and also solutions that none of us had come up with that were just absolutely brilliant. He didn't bring it up in the meeting. Now, I could say that he was also of Asian descent, a recent immigrant. So, okay, I can understand not wanting to engage. That was my third culture, a kid coming out. But the problem I faced was with the other individual that didn't engage. He was a seventh generation Canadian, and he also wasn't engaging. I pulled him aside later on and I talked with him to find out he had some brilliant ideas. It was at that point I realized I don't really get it. I don't understand. And I'm putting myself forward and I don't understand what makes these things tick. And I've been struggling since then. And this is why, also my own experiences as being a visible minority growing up and the changes that I've seen in the workplace, is how do we get the best from people? How do we help folks that are coming here integrate and also provide the inputs that are going to move our country forward? We're a small nation that punches way above our weight. And we have this beautiful opportunity right now to be able to punch even higher above our weight. So this led over the years of trying to different things, different ways of teaching. And I think it was 2014, Erin Meyer wrote the book Culture Map. And she came up with a model based on her research and existing models that were there. So this is based on research of sort of 8 dimensions that you see here that related to business, that related to teams. The initial version of the model still compared only against countries. But recently, what that she's done with her research and moving it forward is looked at comparing traits of individuals and removing the country. So the stereotyping that we talked about starts to disappear. And we've been using this in the MBA programs and some of the graduate programs of helping teams to recognize the strengths that they have and help each of them see things that go on.
Yeah, so if we think about your story with the people that you took for those 6 12-hour days in that structured environment and office, and then you transition to an informal dinner at the end of it, and some of the information started pouring out of the one individual who started to synthesize everything. I think you took some time to map out here what the team potentially could have looked like had you had this tool.
Yeah, I didn't have the tool at that time. And it was interesting. I was focusing on just one thing of how to keep the team together moving forward. But using some of the profiles of that I have been working with, said, what would my team look like? Not all 11 people or 12, including myself, are mapped here. But this would be a fairly good representation across all of these 8 dimensions. And you can see this team has a lot of diversity. And one might argue that we all need to be the same. And when Christina and I are working with teams, one of the challenges with if everybody looks the same is you might get into groupthink. You can move down a path without seeing the innovation. Here, you've got some interesting inputs. And if you can harness that energy that this team has and help people to understand why folks are behaving. We come back to it's the way we solve problems. It's not about the end goal. And so I want to solve it this way. You want to solve it that way. We're still going to the same goal, and both are perfectly fine. So how do we get people to understand?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the disagreeing dimension and how that played out in that story. And of course, when you think about disagreeing, you often probably have this image of conflict that comes to mind and going head to head. And of course, in our beautiful image here, I'm sure the rhino would win. But disagreeing on the tool that we're using is really about how we engage in confrontation when there comes to be some sort of a disagreement or a contentious issue. So some people are very comfortable with, direct language and confrontation, and even see it as a process that's really going to enrich the outcome, whereas others gravitate to avoiding confrontation, and it's a focus on group harmony. How do we maintain harmony in the group? And when I think about your story and having really heated dialogue within those meetings, which happens quite regularly in the workplace, then sometimes those who are sitting back are probably trying to piece together, oh, they're feeling the friction and divisions within the group, and they don't want to add to that. They want to try and bring the group back to some level of harmony so that it can harmoniously work through these challenges or issues. And so, Erin Myers also does plot out the countries for a reference point. And again, you mentioned the one individual who was from Asia. You can see on the graph that oftentimes in those cultures, the focus is on maintaining harmony. And there's a concern about having, negative impacts on the relationships or the group if you're, directly confronting somebody. And of course, some people have heard of the term of saving face and so forth, that we don't necessarily want to challenge each other in front of a group setting. If anything, that might be done in private. Whereas, the second individual in that story would have fit more in the middle of the graph. And in that situation, you might find it go either way in different situations. In some situations, perhaps being a little bit more direct or comfortable with the disagreement, and other times maybe focusing on the group harmony. But I think one of the things to point out again is that there can be individual variation from those country profiles.
Absolutely. And that was what happened in this case. The individual I'm talking about, that was a 7th generation Canadian, he was a peacekeeper. That's how he'd grown up. That was through his training and everything else that he had done. And so starting to understand that, and the team starting to understand that, we were able to actually come together as a team. We were very close to being fractured at that point. Now, I do also want to point out something. We're just looking at one dimension. There was a lot more going on here. It's not just that one dimension, right? But we have a limited amount of time, and we wanted to spend some time talking about that.
Okay, so now bringing this a little bit together, if we think about, how do we take an adaptive leadership approach? So if you think about the context of that story, I see a lot of very standard experiences in that situation to the Canadian work environment. And for me, a lot of that was also around, the environment and the setting. Now, all of a sudden, you go for an informal dinner where everybody's a little bit more relaxed and social, and how at that point that can really create a situation for somebody to really open up and engage. And what's even more striking is, that potential that we could miss that tremendous value that somebody could bring, where you initially felt, what does that team member have to offer and why are they disengaged, to, oh my gosh, how did I not recognize that brilliance is sitting there? And so we thought about the situation of how do we bring more of that into our structures, our processes, and how we really start to shift the environment that we're working with. So it's not, again, about having to change your leadership style or who you are as a leader so much as it is about how do we start to pull and bridge more and open up the dialogue amongst the team in a way that feels comfortable and safe for everybody.
And also your employees don't need to change either. This is not about you have to adapt or change to be somebody else. This is about understanding. And what we talk about to folks that we work with is this is about curiosity. If somebody is behaving differently than you in a situation, rather than attacking them or thinking they're not going to, they're not working properly, is to be curious why they're doing that. And eventually people start to understand how each of us works. We can be from Canada and we can still be very different. I can plot teams from Canada. They will be all over the map, just like you saw in the previous one. And what's interesting was conducting a team culture mapping exercise to walk through teams with sort of situations and the aha moments that people have. Oh, that's why they do that. Oh, that's what's going on here. I never thought about it. So, coming back to me as a third culture adult, I'm supposed to know about culture because, I spent my entire life traveling and in other places, but I'm no better. And it took me a lot to understand how to get the best out of people, to accomplish goals, how to make sure that they're going to grow and get the best that they need for themselves as well. So these are just some of the things that I could have done with that team had I known ahead of time to get rid of the tension. Would we have had to have 12-hour meetings? No. Would we have had to have the conflicts that occurred and the bruised egos and that happened during those 6 days? Absolutely not. Would I have had to spend months trying to repair the damage that was done during that 1 week? Absolutely not. That time could have been spent being more productive and accomplishing what we needed to accomplish.
And any individual, I think, can really extract a lot of value out of really having that, more deeper understanding about these different types of variations in approach that the Aaron Meyer tool offers. But the richest engagement that we've seen is when a whole team goes through it, because then all of a sudden you're creating whole new dialogue that never existed, of really trying to share and understand, different approaches and how we then, adapt or work differently with that. So, if we want to think about how do you take this personally, the value out of it, or for your organization as well, there is a lot of research that's been done as well that talks about how the greater that we can increase diversity, and especially at the leadership levels, there's evidence that you can outperform the competition. And so McKinsey, of course, is one of those companies that regularly does research and has written multiple reports on the value of diversity, of course. And, there's one of their statistics there for you, that the teams with higher levels of diversity at the executive level are 33% more likely to outperform their peers on profitability.
And you're going to have employees, if you can adapt, who are going to always feel valued, or most of the time, and are going to be heard. And you're going to deal with customers and your other stakeholders in a way that they want to come back and continue doing business with you. So there's a lot to be gained here. And come back to, as a country, we punch above our weight. It gives us that ability to be able to work overseas in a way other countries can't. We have this amazing opportunity right now as a country to define what the future of our country will look like. So should we turn it back to Meredith?
Hello, you two. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And we have had some questions coming in and also some comments, but I'm going to start with a question from the audience.
Okay.
The question is, let's say you encourage open conflict in team discussions because it brings creativity and a wide range of perspectives. How can you engage members who are hesitant towards direct confrontation?
Yeah, so a lot of that is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking that, because I think that one is it really puts this to the forefront of how valuable it can be. And that is that we think about how we maybe look at different structures for doing that. When we're really looking for putting on like the different creative thinking hats, sometimes it's about, for example, how in Shay's story, perhaps the leader steps out of the room because for some, there's that respect for hierarchy and, not having those discussions in front of the boss. So sometimes it might be sending out the team to have those discussions on their own. And so breaking people off in mini pods, or using different formats like, partitioning out different discussion points and saying, okay, think and talk about that as pairs, come back and bring it back, or even giving people the advance notice is that this is what we are going to talk about, rather than putting them on the spot, so that they at least have the chance to maybe formulate some of their ideas and opinions beforehand. So yeah, you're not necessarily going to open up a room full of dialogue and have that, people who don't innately feel comfortable challenging in front of the group start to do that, because that would be like saying, if you had any particular habit that you've lived with all your life, change it all of a sudden. Well, it's not that easy to do, right? It's a really innate and ingrained thing. And so really what we're looking for is, how do we create the processes and situations that enable those people to bring that to the forefront.
And be comfortable, and also understand when somebody is, for example, being more direct in the conflict, it's not personal. They're actually attacking a problem, not you personally at this point. But again, having people understand where each of them is coming from and their styles are coming from, then it's suddenly, oh, okay, that person's not attacking me. Because sometimes some people can be very blunt, very to the point on some issues, and other people are a little more circumspect getting there.
And we've also seen that with some of the teams that we've worked with, that once they've had this shared understanding about how people work differently, the ones that we've run through the culture map tool and the dimensions, and we've plotted them all out, and then had a discussion and a debrief about that, all of a sudden people naturally start to gravitate to finding ways to do it differently. And there was one team that the person felt really uncomfortable with the direct confrontation, but then all of a sudden they had a buddy within the group that would chat to them outside of the formal structured teams, and they would bring those ideas to the forefront. So there's lots of creativity that starts to come up the more that the whole team starts to understand these differences.
Right. And then to that point, though, are there tips for managers or bosses to introduce this as a notion to their team? Like, hey, you're being more confrontational because you're from this background and you're this background, and that's why, how do you bring it up in a meeting?
It's kind of what Christina was saying. Everybody likes to go, well, I shouldn't say everybody, because there's some people that don't like to do these personal, but people are hesitant to do this tool because they're afraid that it's going to get them pigeonholed. And so what the interesting thing is, it has to be done in an environment that's safe, and somebody who can facilitate this and as a learning tool, and let everybody speak and have their turn to speak and sort of talk about things and guide the discussion. And you can almost see the hesitation when we do this at the beginning, and by the end, everybody is talking, oh, I didn't know this, I did. And so it's a process you have to go through, and it may not be the leader that does it. It may have to be somebody else that comes in, because if you have members of the team who are, say, from hierarchical society, they may just think, oh, I'm forced to do this, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of that also comes to what level of trust exists within the team. And trusting is also one of the dimensions in the profile tool. But depending on what the state is of the team, if they have a high degree of trust, generally, the team tends to be far more open and engaging in these types of discussions. And in situations where maybe there has been a longer history of challenge in the team functionality, then sometimes it is beneficial to bring in somebody external, so that it's not viewed as this is the latest thing that they're going to try and bring in to shift and to change us, but rather just to have an experience where somebody can start to open up the dialogue. And typically what happens is people start to recognize those funny stories or nuances and understand, oh my gosh, I wished I'd have known that when we were in this situation, because now it makes so much sense. Right.
So thanks for clarifying. So outside facilitator sounds like a good approach. Okay, I've got lots more questions coming in, so I want to get to some of these. We've got this question. This cultural mapping is so useful, realizing that we don't want to put people tightly into boxes because everyone is unique. I'm still wondering whether you've noticed any particular cultural tendencies that are frequently seen in Gen Z in the workplace. Now, Gen Z across various cultural backgrounds.
Right. Well, I mean, we can define culture across gender, across sexual orientation, age groups. Unfortunately, I can't say that I've done enough research to be able to specifically, like, I haven't done it to specifically for that purpose. I mean, right now, as we've been developing and talking to folks, the last thing we want to do is to get them to feel like they're guinea pigs, because this is such a personal thing to individuals. And again, that's a stereotype. Did X acts this way? So I'm a baby boomer, and I tell you what, the generation ahead of us, we thought they were, a certain way, and guess what we do now? We're exactly like the generation ahead of us. So we all change, right? And so they have every generation has a different viewpoint on the world.
Yeah.
And we have a generation gap here too.
Oh yeah, we do. You guys can wager a guess on our age difference. It's not just culture.
Oh, we'll let people put that in the Q&A.
Have to have some prize for whoever gets it on the nail on the head. But anyway, I was going to say I've done a lot of work and workshops dealing with multiple generational differences and levels, and it's always been fascinating because some of the more experienced generations, they want to be respected for all the years of service they've put in and the experience that they've accumulated and so forth. And then you get some from the younger generations that say, I have great ideas. I'm vibrant. I can think of all these different things that, I think would really transform things and shake things up for the better. But I don't feel like, there's a receptivity for it to be heard amongst the older generations. And what I can say is that time and time again, when we've run those workshops, what's happened is by actually opening up that dialogue on that topic, it starts to shift people into recognizing where they're leaving, value on the table, because every single one of the individuals is looking for that sense of feeling valued and validation. And the question is, maybe around even that adage, from Stephen Covey about seek first to understand before being understood. But when we really start to open up that dialogue, there's communication that starts to flow, and they figure out, here's how it would work for me. And they talk about it, this is what I find abrasive. This is what would work better. And then people start to shift in how they're approaching it because they've been told, oh, they don't like when I approach it this way, when I try to use the push strategy. But if I try and partner or, inquire or do it this way, they'll hear me.
Right. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Here's a specific question about the use of team charters. For people not aware of team charters, those would be like sort of agreements that you make sort of going into a team project or a team arrangement. This person asks, have you used team charters? And if so, how have they affected teamwork, leadership, and or collaboration? Does team charters sort of play into what you're talking about?
Yeah, a beautiful question. I love it. Thank you for that. I've worked extensively with team charters in the world of organizational development. I will say, absolutely, there can be great value to be obtained from a team charter when the tool is used effectively, okay? There is also a lot of situations that I've encountered and witnessed over the years where people get irritated by the team charters. They say this is treating us like children. And they find it a condescending process. And what makes the difference between the two? And, really what it comes down to is when you sign up to use some sort of a tool or methodology, it helps to think about, how am I really going to make this something that helps ground the team? Because if it's just an exercise that we're going to go through and it ends up sitting on a shelf and we never refer to it, people get upset by that because, guess what? Some of us have been there before and done that. But when we're using it as a process of, let's look at the dialogue of how we work together and let's think about what commitments, we're authentically going to make to each other and how we're going to keep that alive. What's going to be our process? Some people come back and do some check-ins and they say, we talked about, this is a principle of how we were going to operate. Let's say, that, when we find ourselves in conflict, we're going to agree that the first step is we're going to talk to the person that, we have a challenge or an issue with. And then you find the team moves along and that doesn't happen. Maybe they went to a coworker and now they feel like they're talking behind their back, or they went to the boss and they're like, well, you threw me under the bus. So, it's about not using it in a punitive way, but as an opportunity to dialogue again and say, okay, so we talked about that as a commitment. So help me understand about, why it went a different way and what would make it feel more comfortable, or what even was uncomfortable about doing that, so that we can help people really work on those relationships with each other, and do it in a different way.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Here's a question. We have a weekly manager meeting in our organization, which is about 15 managers for a 15-minute meeting on a predetermined topic. Whenever we ask for people to share for a discussion or feedback, there is silence. What are some first steps to try to change this and get more participation? Is that something that you guys can address?
Well, that's an interesting question. Feedback, I guess it would be interesting to understand what the feedback is. Is it on the meeting? Is it on something else? So it depends on sort of, again, where the managers are from, sort of what their profiles look like, why they're hesitant. And if you can get to the bottom of that, again, it's no different than my story is. Maybe there's a different way, because in Canada, we believe that a good meeting is one where we go and discuss ideas. And then at the end, we have an exit plan when we leave. If you're in parts of Europe, a good meeting is when you just discuss ideas and have a debate. In other parts of the world, a good meeting is when you rubber stamp things that have been decided outside of the meeting. So the discussion goes outside. So there's a lot of variables that I don't understand behind that question, but there would be a way, knowing all those variables, to get the managers to engage, understand why they're not sharing, right? And I've run teams internationally where if I put the team members on the spot, they will say yes, regardless of what the question is. They hate not knowing where I'm coming from, being put on the spot. So it's absolutely, there's ways to deal with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think maybe the only thing I'd add is, oftentimes if I tell people to remember nothing else, I tell them to remember curiosity and how do we make the other person feel valued and heard and understood. And the reason for that is because I've seen a lot of leaders over the years say, I create a safe environment. I ask people for their ideas all the time. And sometimes I'm still met with dead silence. And, then sometimes you're asked perhaps, in a coaching situation to come sit in on the meeting. And then you hear comments, for example, like, okay, yes, that's an interesting idea, but, or there's some sort of like a shutdown to that of why that won't work. And if we're not cautious around our language and how we're receiving ideas, then people maybe develop sometimes an impression that, maybe they're not really as open to different ideas because I didn't feel like it was even, really explored. It felt dismissed pretty quickly. And so there's where a lot of that scale of sensitivity starts to play in to, for example, the disagreeing about how directly we confront ideas. Some people think it's a really enriching experience and they want it. That's like their challenge and it invigorates them. And others, it just shuts down the dialogue.
Right. Oh my gosh. All right. Thank you. The questions, this always happens. We've got such good questions and many excellent comments, and I wish we had time. I'm going to take this one. What are your thoughts and recommendations with respect to taking the team culture mapping exercise and aggregating this to identify trends and patterns at the organizational level? What are your thoughts, recommendations, considerations in this regard? Fascinating work. Thank you.
Yeah, no, what's interesting about it is like, the way that the culture map works is that and the way that the tool has now been set up is that if let's say everybody in the organization enters into this, then people can go in and map whichever teams they're working on. So it's a very flexible thing. You can start to see as teams change too. So I'm not sure about aggregating it, but what starts to happen is if you have work teams, if you have a team that's set up for a specific task, you do the map ahead of time, do the briefing as to what the strengths are of each individual, etc. It actually really helps because we spend less time than in conflict when somebody does something differently because you've had that discussion. So spending that hour ahead of time, sort of, not the team charter, but going through the analysis takes away hours and hours of potential conflict because now people understand where each other are coming from.
Right. Oh my goodness, I'm just sifting through. I love our audience. They're so good. Okay, thank you for sharing these powerful concepts and the effective examples. You referred to Canadian culture, and discussed immigration to Canada. Has there been research, or do you have experience working with Indigenous Canadians? Any thoughts to share, particularly considering the diversity and history of First Nations people in Canada?
Yeah, and for the person that put that comment out there, Christina had discussed that because we tend to look at Canadians as sort of the non-Indigenous. So I have actually worked a lot with the Indigenous community in my practice of law. And are people different? If that's the question, yes. Does that mean that they should be discounted? Absolutely not. I mean, everybody brings strength into this. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding because what's happened is there's been a lot of stereotyping that's occurred and not looking at individuals. And so once you start looking at individuals rather than what you are or some label that you put on, and so the tool is really designed to pull all that stuff away and look at you as an individual. And how do we move forward?
But this is also the importance of the work, is because we want to see those bridges built across all cultures. And I'm glad that that question came up, because it is so essential to think about, how do we really start to ensure that everyone has that value at the forefront. And there's definitely a lot of history that we could talk about. And I guess every culture probably has some skeletons in the closet too, right? And I think the value is in thinking about how we work to connect on a level of humanity.
Right. Thank you. I am looking at time. I've got a lot of other questions. One I think is worth addressing. Somebody's asked, is this kind of training and coaching something you guys do for organizations? This is not a moment. I mean, I'm not meaning to put you on the spot to plug your independent work, but are there people, if people wanted to engage someone doing this kind of work, like who would they look for?
This is the stuff that we do. We do it at this school. We do it for private companies as well too.
Yeah.
And if someone's in a different place, like how do they, what are they looking for in this kind of facilitator? Or are you guys quite unique in what you do?
That's an interesting question. How's that for putting us on the spot? You know what? It's been a model. There's a lot of people doing, and this has been the challenge. Is initially when we looked at this program, it was a cultural intelligence. It's because of what's been going on with the EDII initiatives, etc. It's become a much maligned word, and people are saying, there's a lot of this going on, and there's lots of folks that could probably do it. We've kind of taken a very different approach, bringing an OB background, sort of the way we've looked at it. And we've been refining it for quite a few years, working with a lot of MBA teams and then moving that into the private sector. So one of the students in one of the MBA teams, we implemented it into her company that's a global company. And what she's told me is the productivity in her company has just gone up. And people suddenly going, wait a minute, now I know why Jack does that or why somebody does that. Yeah. And the conflict has gone down. And so people see the benefit there's a combination of coaching as well as analysis. I mean, you can use any tool and you can do a generic brief, but it doesn't really help people. You really have to get down to the level and be engaged with the individuals and understand where the individuals are coming from.
Yeah, so I mean, we do both workshops that are a little bit more standardized as well as custom work for organizations. And I mean, as Shay mentioned, there are other tools, there are other folks that do this as well. And you know what, we see value in all of that work. So I think the importance is that you find, facilitators that you connect with and that align with what you're trying to achieve.
Right. And also somebody's asked about further learning and resources that you might recommend. I know you mentioned a few in the presentation. To remind our audience, they will be getting a copy of the presentation on Tuesday, but any other resources that it's worth directing people to in our last minute?
There's lots of resources.
Extensive now.
If you
Oh,
could, my bookshelf
fun.
behind me, I've got three. We've got three
We've got
entire bookshelves full of resources.
Yeah, 3 of the double bookshelves,
Yes.
like the nice.
Okay, you guys have books. Come
Yeah.
on.
But you know,
Okay.
definitely, you know, if you even pick up a copy of Erin Meyer's book or look at, you know, her website and tools, you know, there's those that have been in the space for a long time as well. Like we mentioned, you know, Hofstede, Trompenaars, and Hampton Turner, they all have websites with information. So, and there's many that are new on the front too that are coming out with great information. So, for those that want to dive into it, there is lots there.
Okay, that's really good to know. So yeah, so people will get all that information when they get the copy of the presentation on Tuesday. As we close, I do want to point out we've had one bet come in on your age difference. The bet is for 16 years. I don't know if you want to, you
Was
might
there
want to say
nothing
mom.
higher?
There was nothing higher.
No, we got 16 years. We only had one participant in that
See,
particular
people are
gamble.
afraid to bet on that.
Ah.
They're a little low.
Hello. All right.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we are at time. I have to do a quick plug which involves you guys because as I always do, I remind people that we have lots of opportunities for online learning at Smith School of Business. And I think you two, Shay and Christina, are going to be leading a session about adaptive leadership later in June. Can you give us a sense, just sort of a very brief overview of what people might expect from that session?
Sure. What you got a little bit of it today. We're going to expand, do a lot of experiential learning, how to not just the theory, but how do we put this into practice? Right. And so we'll put people into scenarios, teams, sort of do the evaluation, use the culture map here too, and get people comfortable on how to use that themselves as they go back into their organization.
Yeah, experiencing the tool and debriefing what that looks like, having some personal reflection on that, and looking at how that engages with others that they're put in teams with. And of course, maybe we'll save the actual age gap for those that show up.
People have to sign up to find out. All right. For anyone who's interested in that, visit smithqueens.com/execed and you'll find more information there. I believe it's 2 half days. Is that true? In terms of time commitment, I think it's something like 2 half days. Yeah.
I think it's 4 half days.
4 half days. Anyway, it will be a value, I'm sure. So the last thing I'm going to do is remind our audience about our next free webinar, which will be Thursday, June the 24th. We'll be talking about finding your voice at work. Statistics indicate that as many as half of employees in typical organizations do not speak up in meetings. And this session will look at how to effectively share your ideas and insights and what leaders can do to help their people speak up and contribute more often. So 2:02, we went 2 minutes over, but thank you, audience. Thank you for your excellent questions and your very valuable comments. And I'm really sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them, but we will pass them on to our presenters. So Shay and Christina, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've given our audience a huge gift with all of your knowledge. So thanks very much. And we'll see you all at the next webinar on June 24th. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.